Hello and welcome to Chapter 5, Crisis Institutionalized and Transformed, 1945 to 1989. Let's have a quick look at the map from the beginning of the chapter and have a think about what we are going to be dealing with in this chapter, which is largely the Cold War and decolonization. So here we can see the NATO countries, that's North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries in blue, including Europe, Western Europe, important point there, Western Europe and Finland and the United States, of course, and Turkey, Greece, okay, and on the Warsaw Pact time, Eastern Europe and Russia. And other communist countries in pink, mainly China, we should look at, in Vietnam, North Korea, and excuse me, that keeps happening. And then in green and brownie here, we're looking at non-aligned and decolonized countries from this period. Also NATO allies, we should point out Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Africa. Okay, so what we're looking at is how the recovery of the global network after World War I intersected with the bipolar world that was created by Cold War hierarchies, by the US on one side and the USSR on the other side. And then the patterns and consequences and causes of the Cold War, which are really quite complicated and much more complicated than we tend to sort of boil it down to competing economic systems. But really there's a lot more going on because in actual fact the US and the USSR were not that different. And then other complications between a rift between communist countries as well, between the Soviet Union, communist China, and what this all meant to Asia and other places in the world that were impacted by these Cold War differences. And then lastly, at the course and the causes and development of decolonization as the colonies, these empires that had been built up by European powers during the course of the 19th century were dismantled a mere less than 100 years later, but the horrible problems that these caused for the newly independent nations as they attempted to begin nation building anew. So let's not forget to look at our principles and patterns this week. Two things, and they seem kind of contradictory, that the images on people's cultural screens are almost as real or have as much reality when it comes to affecting what people do as actual material reality does. But as much as the screen images matter, so does this material reality. And then a very important point, that the century from 1850 to 1950 that saw these European empires, these vast imperial holdings, was very much an anomaly as we've looked at the last 22 centuries of human history. And understanding this is one of the benefits of doing world history, that if the world wasn't always shaped the way it is today, with rich developed countries and underdeveloped third world countries, and we'll talk more about that term third world in a little bit. But what happened in this period, the imperialism of this period, really caused this very lopsided world that we have today. So let's think briefly also about our issues in doing world history points today. And basically because even though we've still got a week to go, we're moving pretty much to the end point of doing traditional narrative history. And then next week we're going to move into more contemporary issues, which we can't talk about in the same way as we've talked about things to the past, because these are still ongoing. So if we think about history as a way of understanding who we are and how our world came to be, in distant history, the tension is between trying to understand the past and in the terms of people from the past and not in our own terms. But on the plus side, we do get to speak about history in broad general terms because, hindsight is 2020, as people say, and we can look back at the past and see these broad strokes more clearly. But in contemporary history, and we're talking about history here from 1970 onwards, it's very hard to see these broad terms, to see these broad strokes. And so making those kinds of statements is always going to be more limited. And what we're looking at always has to be a little more precise and specific. Because we're looking at individual actions and we can't really see the big picture yet. And so the meanings of what's happening are more contested. And also, obviously, the end point is constantly moving. So we have no real perspective which to look at the present and more contemporary history. And we see, books that sell very well, such as David Landis's book, Why Some Nations Are Poor and Why Some Nations Are Rich. And he's rather assuming that this is the end point, and this is how he's kind of looking at things as a progression that's got to an end point and doesn't actually see the process as ongoing. And this has made his perspective a little bit, shall we say, racist, for want of a better word, even though a lot of people have been very influenced by such historians who are trying to see the big picture but don't actually see that the end point is moving, and try to explain things without actually understanding that the last 100 years is an anomaly, is not leading to a concrete endpoint of rich Western Americanized countries and poor third world. Anyway, let's move on to think about the contents of our chapter. Before I do that, I almost forgot to talk about our readings for today. So our first reading is Nehru's speech on the granting of independence of India in 1947. And Jawaharlal Nehru became the first Prime Minister of India in 1947 until 1964. Now, he was a nationalist and very active in Indian independence movement. Now, we've used this word nationalism in the past, and it's always had this negative connotation. It was applied to European nationalism and the lead up to World War I and World War II. Nationalism is also this feeling that's very much involved in decolonization, and arguably is a little more positive in the end here, that national self-determination, sort of freedom from colonial power, the right to be a nation that rules itself, is also a branch of nationalism. Nehru was very much mentored by Gandhi, who I really hope you have heard of. But against Gandhi's advice, he went along with a plan to partition India. And this wasn't actually revealed until shortly after this speech was made, but you can see hints of it in this speech. And our second source is Mao Zedong's report on the investigation of the peasant movement of Hunan in 1927. Mao Zedong, as you should probably know, is the first chairman of the Communist Party of China from the founding of the People's Republic in 1949 to his death in 1976. And the background of this particular piece is the Chinese Civil War, in which Mao Zedong led a small peasant army against the Chinese National Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, which was, nationalist and also quite corrupt. Okay, our next piece is rather odd, and it took me a few reads through to get what was going on this, so bear with it. It's an American comic strip by the famous comic artist Walt Kelly from 1955, who was famous for this character Pogo. And in this particular piece, he's poking fun at both sides of the Cold War in this piece, and their very entrenched ideas that have not really very much basis in reality. And this is a prime example of how humour has always been linked with political satire, and even going back to the Greeks, who were very famous for this. Okay, and our next two pieces 25.4a is Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese Declaration of Independence from 1945, and you will see very strong echoes in here of the American Independence Treaty, and this is because Ho Chi Minh is trying to get, in 1945, support from the Americans in his war against France. France is the imperial power that controls Vietnam in this period, and Ho Chi Minh wants independence from France and is trying to curry favor at this point in time with the US. When they actually win the war against France, the US, of course, intervenes and then fights against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Okay, and then we see the another document here about Vietnam from Vo Nhung and Giap from 1962, the People's War, and in this Vo Nhung and Giap is writing a piece about his experiences fighting against France for the independence of Vietnam, and he's writing this piece very much to encourage other small undeveloped countries to fight against major Western powers, and showing them the sort of how-to guide of how to fight against a much superior military force with the sort of guerrilla tactics that smaller anti-colonial fighters could use. Okay, so before I move on from this picture, the other thing we have to sort of realize that the consequence of both World War II, the end of World War II, the Cold War and decolonization, is that it produces something that looks like this in the end, this very bloated map of the world, and in terms of gross domestic product. So you can see here that the big balloons are the US, especially if you compare it to the size of the economies of South America. It's kind of distorted. The massive distortion of Africa, which is the skinny little worm sort of appended to North Africa here, and the size of the US, the European economy, and within that the sort of overwhelming size in some ways of the UK economy, which looks nothing like the map of the real UK, and then over on the other side the size of the Japanese economy, which is quite a small island and is, you know, sort of dominating over the size of China and India here. Okay. So size is money. These are the sizes of the economies, and this is the reality that we get to by 1970. And remember I said that in 1850, so 120 years before, we were at a position where no one economy was really more than twice the size of any other economy before the start of industrialization, so we can really see how lopsided the wealth of the world has become by 1970. And so this has led to a situation of drastic underdevelopment in some areas. And what you're looking at here is a slum area in Nairobi in Kenya. These areas, as the caption says, not only lack resources, but they don't even actually own the resources that they have, though. These tiny shanty properties that they occupy, and these are subject to being frequently bulldozed by the central government. So this is how we get to this picture is really the focus of what we're going to talk about today. So we see at the end of World War II, the US emerged unchallenged as the world's greatest economic power. The World War II actually strengthened what had been a rather flagging US economy coming out of the Great Depression. And this is because, you know, the US stayed out of World War II for the first few years until Britain was fighting on her own, and then provided impetus with its military spending to its own economy. But at the end of war, it needed partners to trade with. You can't survive as a leading global economy if you're the only economy. So it set about rebuilding the global economy and strengthening both its allies and its enemies. So both Britain and France, but also Germany and Japan as well. And this part of this thinking was also to try and strengthen the world against communist inroads. And this was the Marshall Plan, which you'll read about in your book. And then the Bretton Woods Agreement really provides the mechanisms by which a global economy should work, how global financial transactions should operate through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This is very successful for the US, for Western Europe, and for Japan. Obviously not so successful for other places in the world, as we can see in this picture. But it forms a foundation of globalism, which is not just economic, but also cultural. It becomes imperfect in many ways because of the allied competition between capitalist and communist powers in this period. So let's move on and think about this polarity, how this is created. It's most clear, perhaps, in Europe, where a big line, is drawn down the center of Europe, the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill called it, and the division military politically in Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But there's also a bipolarity, in the way that images are projected. And this is what we're looking at here. Sure, I want to fight communism, but how? Well, we put your money where your mouth is and support Radio Free Europe, which is, bombasted in Eastern Europe with capitalist messages. And also, this contrasting picture here, and I do not read Russian. So what I'm assuming is going on here, or what I know from the caption, is the idea of how a talent cannot thrive in a capitalist economy, but it is supported in the communist economy. And we also see the idea of capitalism, literally taking the milk out of the mouths of babes in a capitalist system, and also the tagline that has not actually been attached to the recent Marvel movies, Captain America, Commie Smasher. Of course, this is what Captain America was all about originally. And so as we talk about this line being drawn down the center of Europe, even the city of Berlin is divided into eastern and western halves. And here you see the famous Berlin Airlift, as the city is divided, which is dropping food parcels to stranded West Berlin. The city of Berlin actually is in the eastern part of Germany, now East Germany. The city of Berlin sits there, but it has its own western half, which is why food parcels needed to be dropped. We also need to talk about other things that are happening in this period. And you're seeing here Nixon cozying up with the Chinese premier and sharing a meal. So you have even these splits within communism that occur between the Russian communism and Chinese communism. This complicates the idea even further. And here you see Indira Gandhi, who is the Premier of India, meeting with the Premier of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev. Now, what the Indians were trying to do, and what a lot of the countries were trying to do that weren't part of either NATO or the communist bloc, were to stay independent of that bipolar competition. So Indira Gandhi is meeting here with Nikita Khrushchev, but this does not imply that she is leaning towards the communist side. She's very stridently trying to stay independent. The word that the US and the USSR used for independent countries was non-aligned. And if you think about this word non-aligned, what it really means is there should be an alignment. The natural position is an alignment on one side or the other. And this hasn't quite happened yet, but they're going to try and force it to happen by having the country choose which way, capitalist or communist, they are going to industrialize and therefore modernize. Okay, so this crisis also involves hot wars, and we call it the Cold War, but it also involves, actual fighting, actual loss of life, massive spending on military arms, and these all have their consequences. Okay, so this is an interesting map of the world, and it'll take you a little while to get your eyes sort of adjusted. But look at where Canada is and the USSR is, and this is usually sort of the top of a global map. But what this is showing is Cold War conflict, where nuclear weapons are based, where direct military action in form of the hammer and sickle is placed by the USSR, where direct military action is by the USA, and where economic and political intervention is perpetrated. I don't even perpetrate economic intervention. That's maybe the wrong choice of word. Economic and political intervention is used by the USSR and the USA. So you can see this happening, in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Africa, and in Asia. So what is the Cold War all about? Well, it's really about a diplomatic failure to turn victory into peace at the end of the Second World War, which was reinforced by writers of the time, by historians who stressed the ideological differences, long-term ideological differences between the two sides. But then it turns into this power politics between powers that are acting in a very neo-imperialist way by trying to grab the sides of alignment of the non-aligned countries. We should probably use the word independent. And then this development of a really, really deep mutual distrust, which can be more readily understood now after the end of the Cold War, as Soviet archives and US documents are becoming declassified. I'm going to leave you to read on your own about some of these effects in Asia, the Chinese Revolution, the Korea War, and the split between China and the USSR. But this leads to a generalized pattern in the Cold War of competition and periodic crisis. And the closest that the world came to, destroying itself was probably the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was kind of narrowly averted, actually going to nuclear war by last-minute diplomatic measures. Okay, so, we've talked about, this is what we're talking about, nuclear weapons, but we're also talking about massive buildup of other armaments too. And the world was really massively, overarmed and could destroy itself many, many times over. But all that spending on arms, just think about what it could have done in terms of how the world is situated today. And we're also looking here at the cultural consequences of the Cold War, and this cartoon is showing us the feelings of Mccarthyism, with the character going, "Keep me quiet, this is the Constitution, it guarantees my right to speak." But he's saying it can't guarantee what happens after you speak up. This is really the idea of McCarthyism here. So we move on now to think a little bit more about decolonization. Decolonization in its basic form is about the breakup of the European empires that had been built up in the late 19th century and lasted for less than 100 years. So we're talking about this anomaly of European hegemony. This should not be seen as an end point in any way, that Western hegemony, Western, including US in this, Western economic might and power over the third world is in any way normal. What the Third World was about in the first instance was political. It was about the First World being the US and NATO, the Second World being the communists and the Warsaw Pact, and the Third World being non-aligned countries. But this really became synonymous then with underdeveloped countries, the poorer countries of the world, as all the world's resources had been sucked into this massive arms race by the First and Second World powers. So we think about the causes of decolonization. You can see the dates here. India goes first in 1947, very shortly after the war, with many other countries following in the 1960s. So the causes are the reversal of demographic patterns in the 1970s, in the 19th century, as European population growth slowed, and therefore there was fewer Europeans to actually rule over their colonies. And changing network flows, and it became that the colonized came to know their colonial masters in a much better way than the colonizers ever came to know those who they ruled over. So this actually gives a benefit to the colonized in terms of dealing with trying to gain their independence. They know the politics, they know how to talk the talk of freedom and independence much more than the colonizers ever came to know what was going on in the countries which they ruled over. And there's also the damage that the industrial imperialist powers did to themselves during World War I and World War II, from which they're trying to recover. And World War II had also proven what the Japanese had started to prove in its success in the war in 1905 over Russia, which was that Europeans were not all that, or all that effective, that non-Europeans could defeat European powers. The task of defending imperialism became very, very complicated by World War II, because World War II was really a battle between aggressive fascism and democratic freedom. Okay, so democratic freedom wins. Where does this leave imperialism, which is really about taking away freedom from other peoples? There were arguments for a gradualist approach that said the countries needed to be trained for independence, and this is what ironically, what the imperial powers were doing there. They weren't there forever. They were just training the colonized peoples to rule themselves. It's a bit of an odd argument to get your head around. But this sort of gradualist argument was also in place in America at the time, in those who were opposing civil rights. So who were saying, well, we'll get there eventually, but the country's not ready for it yet. So independence movements really drew on three ideological grounds, and that is democracy and concepts of universal human rights, on nationalism and the principles of self-determination, and on the anti-imperialism of communism. And you can understand this in some way, that communism offered a critique of capitalism, and capitalism, remember, is not synonymous with democracy, but capitalism is about, in some ways, exploiting those people below to concentrate wealth and power into the hands of people on top. And so when this is applied to the colonial situation, it explains the poverty that has been caused in colonial countries and the wealth that the imperialist countries have. So communism becomes quite attractive to independence seekers. The process of decolonization differs in different places. Britain, who's always kind of been imbued with more senses of freedom in some ways from its own sort of political past, and now its new alliance with the US and its image of itself in World War II as the pioneers of freedom. Britain lets most of its colonies go without a fight, gradually beginning in 1947 with India, as I said, but then moving on to its African colonies in the 1960s. Smaller powers were more reluctant to let their colonies go, for example, Portugal and Angola. But after some hostilities and international pressure, they did actually relent, and those colonies got free. France was a little more determined to hold on to its colonies, and you can understand this in some ways if you think about the humiliation that France had suffered with its defeat in World War II, and then its own cultural image was then placed somewhere further in the past in its pre-war glorious past, which was colonial. So it was kind of more invested in keeping on hold of this colonial image of itself, and therefore it fought brutal wars against independence seekers in Vietnam and in North Africa, in Algeria. And this is a picture of its Algerian idea. We'll talk a little bit more about Angola, because it really shows in the extreme some of the problems that were involved in decolonization. Newly decolonized countries needed to establish three things. They had to establish a successful hierarchy, they had to establish viable network connections, and they had to establish a coherent frame around their cultural screens. They had to establish coherent cultural frame values. Angola fights for its independence against Portugal from 1961 to 1975, and then fights from 1975 to 2002, this horrible, long, drawn-out civil war. There's really four parties involved in the civil war in Angola. Two are really grounded in ethnically based factions, and these two slug it out and become supported by the alternate sides in the civil war. So both factions start out as mildly socialist and wanting sort of the socialist best for their people, but one side becomes more identified with Marxism and receives help from the USSR, and one side becomes more identified with anti-communism and receives help from the USA. And by help we mean guns and weapons. And so this is what perpetrates the long civil war in Angola. There is a third faction that kind of tries to sit out the civil war and eventually receives help from communist China and the US and tries to establish an independent government. And then there's even a fourth faction which doesn't even want to see Angola as a whole country and is fighting for the independence of one province from the rest of Angola. So you can see how the Cold War massively complicates decolonization in this example of Angola. Angola loses 500,000 people, soldiers and civilians, to this civil war. Its infrastructure is left completely in shambles as both sides have attacked the infrastructure, whatever infrastructure, and the colonial powers do not leave a legacy of strong infrastructure anyway. So that's gone. The network connections are kind of limited to arms traders or mineral or oil capitalists who are trying to suck as much out of Angola as they can with giving as a little back to these factional fighters. And so 12 years on now from the civil war in Angola, we're still left with a situation where Angola has the lowest life expectancy, the highest infant mortality. There's no coherent cultural identity, and there's still bands of child soldiers roaming about. And this is all to do with the complications of decolonization and the Cold War. So when we look at these situations, we mustn't look at these countries and say, well, they are unable to be stable. Why are they so poor? We must think about what the West has done in terms of colonization and Cold War to make these situations arise. Okay, but I want to leave you with a little bit more of a positive note on the end of this, that despite all these complications, it does seem like democracy is surviving as a coherent cultural frame in many decolonized places. And what we're looking at here is an elephant carrying voting machines to remote rural districts in India, that despite all these complications, democracy does seem to be emerging as a dominant cultural frame in many decolonized places. So as I talked about, and as we looked in the issues of doing world history this week, we're now going to move on after the collapse of communism in 1989 and 91 to a point in world history where we can no longer really tell the narrative of what has happened, and we have to look instead at surveying what is happening in our contemporary world. And that's what we're going to look at next week. Okay, thanks for listening.